Not guilty. That is the plea given by a Pennsylvania man who stands accused of killing another man who police say was the suspect's boss and friend. 7 News reporter Lexi Burning live from the Lewis County Courthouse with more. Lexi.
Jeff, investigators brought Jacob Van Bergen back to Lewis County from Pennsylvania, where he lived and worked, for his arraignment today here at the Lewis County Courthouse in Lowville. Dressed in orange with chains around his waist, 24-year-old Jacob Van Bergen maintained his innocence Monday with a not guilty plea. He stood before Judge Dan King in the Lewis County Courthouse. According to documents, both Van Bergen and 39-year-old Brandon Shepker were staying at Ridgeview Lodge in Lowville when the two got into a fight. Police say they've been to the area before for snowmobiling, but on this trip they may have been looking at property. Documents say during an interview, Van Bergen admitted to using Shepker's sweatshirt to, quote, impede his breathing, which led to Shepker's death. Van Bergen is being held in the Lewis County Jail on $2 million cash bail. The men were said to be friends. Police say Van Bergen worked for Shepker, who owned a business in Pennsylvania. Lewis County District Attorney Jeffrey Tompkins took over as the county's lead prosecutor earlier this month and will treat this second-degree murder charge like he would any other case.
We've got to make sure that we get out all of our discovery to the defendant's attorney and evaluate the case appropriately depending on the what's presented to us by the investigators.
Tompkins says what makes this case more complex is it crosses state lines.
There's been great communication between the state troopers here and the investigators through the New York State Police and the investigators through Pennsylvania State Police, and I would expect that we're going to need some of the representatives of the Pennsylvania State Police to come up here to testify if it winds up going that far.
Members of Shepker's family made the trip for the 5-minute court appearance and were visibly emotional.
Seeing the defendant in there today, seemed to bring out some additional emotions.
Van Bergen's next court appearance is February 15th at the Lowville Town Court. Jeff.
Lexi Burning live in Lowville tonight. Thank you.